Greetings to my fellow democracy-loving Australians. What an absolute privilege it is to be given the opportunity to address the Victorians' great citizen assembly. I know others have thanked them, but I will also thank the peacemakers who once again have organised today's demonstration and the lengths that they have gone to for months to campaign on behalf of our democracy and in defence of our democracy relentlessly. So let's put a warm round of applause to the humble men with the green vests. My name is George Kapnias and I'm aware of cafe lockdown, but I'm just an average citizen just like yourselves. And the title of my address to you this afternoon is The True Spirit of Australia. I don't think I'm the only one here who has observed that over the past 2 years of being subjected to relentless and sustained mind-altering substances, being government propaganda, ably disseminated by mainstream media, including the ABC, it feels as though the very fabric of our society has changed. Families have become estranged, friends reduced to strangers, and employees with impeccable records have been unceremoniously stood down. Previously trusting neighbours look upon each other with trepidation and suspicion, and our beloved children, Australia's beloved children, are being progressively ostracised from society. It is as though our water source has been contaminated. People seem to be either riddled with anxiety or, a bit like myself, a bit too serious for their own good. And in thinking about what to say here today, I was just wondering whether jokes are still allowed to be told in Australia, or are jokes like thinking and contrary opinions subject to deportation? So Nick, with your permission. I can tell a joke? Okay, jokes are not my forte, guys, so be warned. I'm a bit more like the drummer from the Muppets, but here goes. There's 3 Allied soldiers, a Frenchman, an Englishman and an Australian, and they were fighting for our democracy on the Kokoda Trail. And in the mayhem of battle, they got caught on the wrong side of the battle line. And the Japanese were a bit like today's federal and state politicians. They weren't letting up and they weren't taking any prisoners. So the 3 Allied soldiers thought the only way for them to seek salvation was to bash their way through the Papua New Guinea jungle. And they did so for 3 days and 2 nights until they came out onto this opening. A very, very picturesque opening with a tranquil lake in the middle. They were tired, they were fatigued, mosquito-riddled, so they stripped down to their birth suits and they went in for a dip. But before they could enjoy the moment, they were surrounded by the Indigenous warriors. And the Indigenous warriors instructed them in no uncertain terms to get the hell out of their lake. As they did, they led them to the chief, to the middle of the village. And the chief, they tied him to 3 poles, Englishman, Australian, Frenchman. And the chief read them the riot act. He said, "You have desecrated the sanctity of our lake. And the punishment for such a crime is a gruesome death. We will skin you alive where you stand, and as you stand there, taking your last breath, we will stitch together your human hides, and we will make a canoe. And with that canoe, we will fish on our sacred lake, so everybody around will know that the sacred lake is ours and nobody can touch it without the Indigenous tribe's permission. But," he said, "I am a civilised chief, and I understand my international obligations to the prisoner, and I do know that I have to offer you each one last request." And before he could say it, the Englishman shot up his hand and he said, "Chief, I have one last request." And he said, "Certainly, white man number 1, what is your last request?" And he said, "My request is to have a knife." And the chief reached across to the warrior next to him, handed the Englishman the knife, and he tensed every morsel in his body, looked to the heavens and yelled, "God save the Queen!" And with that, he slit his own throat. And the knife fell to the ground, and before it even touched the ground, the Frenchman white in his eyes with fears, he had wet himself where he stood. He shot up his hand and he said, Monsieur Chief, I also have a request. And he said, what is your request, white man number 2? And he said, could I also have a knife? And he picked up the bloody knife, handed it to the Frenchman, and the Frenchman yelled, Vive la France! Vive la France! And with that, he slit his own throat. And the knife fell to the ground again, and the village, who turned out like we have today, all eyes were on the Australian. And the chief said, white man number 3, do you have a request? And he said, in fact, I do. A little bit casually. He said, I'd like a fork. And he said, a fork, of all things, a fork. You know what awaits you. Anyway, they dug up a fork and they handed the fork to the Australian, and the Australian snatched it from the chief's hands and began to furiously stab his body everywhere, stab his legs, his calves, his heavies, and then he put it in his right hand and he stabbed the Englishman down his torso and stabbed the Frenchman down his torso. And as casually as he could and calmly as he could, handed the fork back to the chief. And the chief said to him, you now had your last request. For as long as I live, I cannot understand white man's customs, but now you have to suffer a gruesome death. And with that, the Australian looked at him in the eye and he said, so be it, but so much for your fucking canoe. In hearing that joke recently, I thought to myself, has the long-held notion that Australians are good-hearted larrikins, rebellious by nature, and even against the odds, are prepared to stare down authority as we did at Eureka, has that all just become a myth? I thought, where is the rebel, the critical thinker, those who have got genuine consideration for those around us who have suffered, the teenagers who have committed self-harm, others, family members who have committed suicide, and the tens of thousands who have suffered debilitating vaccine injuries? Where is the basic principle for love thy neighbour? And if in fact the rebel in the Australians is dead, what of our belief system that we're a loving, tolerant people, an egalitarian society built on a bedrock of mateship? Sadly, over an extended period of time, I began to concede that perhaps these values were also in danger of becoming a myth and no longer an integral part of the Australian character. Perhaps over time we had been reduced to an amorphous blob of anxiety-riddled consumerists, aspirationals and conformists. But then, in the momentous spring awakening, Victorian spring awakening of 2021, I had the great privilege and good fortune to meet all of you, the great citizens of Victoria that are awake, that are engaged, activated and genuinely concerned for the welfare of your fellow man and the future of our democracy. Australians who have retained the capacity for critical thought, of empathy for their fellow man, and have the courage of your convictions despite the malevolence and deceitfulness of our state and federal governments. And if you too are sick to the back teeth of the globalist cheer squad in Morrison, Albanese and Bant and the conga line of sycophants that support them, I assure you that the eject button from this house of horrors that we've been subjected to for the past 2 years is fast approaching, and it is in the form of a federal election which must be held by May. And I urge each of you, I urge each one of you to vote for one of the parties that do stand for the basic principle of civil and political liberties. And these parties include the United Australia Party, the Liberal Democrats, One Nation, and there are others. Political parties whose first order of business is to rid our lives and our great country of mandates, coercion, blackmail, discrimination and segregation, as these qualities have no place in the country we all love. Woo! My fellow Victorians, I know our numbers are subdued today, but we have been at it for months. But I commend each one of you for your courage, as your courage has awoken a nation of cavalry right around this country, as we see hundreds of thousands marched last week, and it's something that you started. And I remind you that fortune, your courage will be rewarded, and fortune does in fact favour the brave. I put it to you that the true spirit of Australia, based on the good-hearted larrikin and genuine mateship, is in fact alive and well, and never ever allow anyone make you disbelieve that. We're a great nation, Australia, and be no doubt the political animals fear each one of you, because each one of you is engaged and activated, and this one gets right up their nose. You're also peaceful and harmonious. I urge you to retain your integrity, stare down the fear and the divisiveness, and with your forks continue to puncture the bullshit narrative that we've been subjected to for the past 2 years. My fellow Australians, I wish upon you all and your families the best of health for 2022. Stay strong, support and encourage each other, and save your wrath for the ballot box. Let's determine to do everything we can to reclaim our democracy, and when we do, freedom will win.